Alright, well today will be the war. Looking at secession, the final breakdown of the Union, the Civil War itself, the leaders, military and political, Abraham Lincoln, President of the United States, Jefferson Davis, Confederate President, Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's Vice President, Alexander Stephens Davis' Vice President. Major battles such as Fort Sumter, and generals such as P.G.T. Beauregard, the Confederate general, CSA stands for Confederate States Army, George McClellan, Earl McDowell, USA standing for United States Army, First Bull Run, also called First Manassas, the Peninsular Campaign, also with the Battle of Yorktown included in there, Second Bull Run, Second Manassas, 1852. In the Civil War, you have a lot of fights over the same territory. They're going back and forth over the same ground. So you're going to have often have the first battle something, second battle something, even third or fourth battle something.
Kind of sounds like they're in a tight spot.
They were, especially in the East. Antietam, David Farragut, Admiral of the United States Navy, battles of Pea Ridge, Shiloh, Memphis, and New Orleans. Our operating thesis for today is the words of Daniel Webster in the height of the 1850 Compromise crisis. One country, one constitution, one destiny. Okay, and that's basically summing up the war for the North. One country, one constitution, one destiny. Like would say, the nation could not endure half slave and half free. And thus secession came. But the North believed that the Constitution demanded the Union be made perfect, unviable. It was not a casual association of political entities. It was a permanent association, a permanent alliance of states. It could not, and secession was illegal. Abraham Lincoln once said about secessions, the idea of secession turns the marriage into the states into some sort of free love society. But let's look at the two sides here before we start diving into the war. Comparing North against South, looking at what they produce and what they have. The North, in terms of industrial workers, more than 10 times as many as the South, 1.3 million versus just 110,000. Those Southern industrial workers were based in the Upper South, portions of Maryland, Northern Virginia, Missouri. Railroad track, 22,000 miles in the north, 9,000 miles in the south. What the South had, mostly running north-south. Very little running east or west. Industrial output, Union over Confederacy, 6-1. Now, in terms of agricultural commodities, they're fairly even in some areas, south dominating some, north in others. Corn production, 48%, that's done in the north, 52% in the south. Wheat, 71% in the north, 29% in the south. Sweet potatoes, which many of us enjoyed this past Thanksgiving. It's ordinarily a southern delicacy. 94% produced in the south, just 6% in the north. But white potatoes, 9-1 in the north. 90% north, 10% south. Horses, pretty close to even, 55% north, 45% south. Mules, they're good for work animals, but mostly southern, 9-1. 90% south, 10% in the north. Sheep, useful for wool and meat and other products. 2-1 advantage in the north, 67% north, 33% in the south. Factories, overwhelmingly northern. Again, almost a 4-to-1 ratio, 78% in the north, 22% in the south. Actually, look at per capita income of various workers. Farmers, fairly close to even, north and south in many areas. Religion, both sides overwhelmingly Protestant. The occasional Catholic, occasional Jew, but mostly, overwhelmingly evangelical Protestants. Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Methodist, Baptist increasing in numbers. Slaves, South monopolizes the slave population. Minor crops, such as the labor-intensive crops, cotton, sugar, rice, tobacco, South has overwhelmingly. Textiles, the North outproduces the South 17-1. Textiles is manufacturing of cloth and clothing. Of course, you're going to need to clothe your troops during the war. You can do that with cotton very easily, but also with wool as well. North outproduces the South. Pig iron, which is used in the production of steel. North outproduces the South 20-1. Firearms, North outproduces the South 32-1. Coal production, for use in said factories, for producing steel and other products, textile products, and on railroads. North outproduces the South 38-1. In terms of population, North has 22 million people, South has 9 million. And of those 9 million, large proportion held in slavery. So if you look at the numbers, advantage is overwhelmingly tilted towards the north. The South is going to hope this will be a repeat of the American Revolution. They're pointing back to figures like George Washington and others that, they could outlast and overpower the North. Well, there's a big difference between the American Revolution and the Civil War. For one thing, much bigger armies, much better ways to transport your troops, much more efficient weaponry. Like I said, the North doesn't have to travel halfway across an ocean. They're right there. So it will basically come down to a war of attrition. South will will be able to deflect a lot of the early Northern advances because they do have some good generals. They do have some good officers. But as the war progresses, the North will be pulling more into its resources, and the South won't have any resources to draw on. By 1862 and 1863, most of the South will be heading into a serious economic depression. Southern armies are facing supply shortages and manpower shortages. You get 1863 and 1864, South will be having increasing problems with desertion. We come to that moment in 1860. Why will the South secede? The Democratic Party going to the convention is fraying very badly. This is the last surviving national party. It was with the constituents, political power, and organizations in both the North and the South. sprang primarily because of the disaster that James Buchanan has been as president and the whole controversy over bleeding Kansas and territorial slavery. They held their convention in the worst place possible, Charleston, South Carolina. Ordinarily a very pleasant, very beautiful city, but the hotbed of secessionist sentiment. You have a number of Southern delegations dominate what they call fire eaters. A fire eater is a 1850 slang term for someone who is supportive of secession no matter the cost. They want the Union dissolved. They want their state to pull out, no matter what. Stephen Douglas is trying to get the nomination, supporting the 1856 platform calling for congressional non-interference in slavery in the territories. But the Southern fire eaters are demanding federal protection for slavery in the territories. One delegate said that William Yancey of Alabama, the mistake of the Northern Democrats is not to defend slavery as a positive good. Well, after the Southern plank was defeated, the Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina delegations walked out of the convention, refusing to support any of the candidates. Two South Carolina Unionist delegates stayed with the regular Democrats. You had a couple of other secessionists from the Southern delegations walking out with the fire eaters. So the convention decided to reconvene in Baltimore, Maryland, and then nominate Stephen A. Douglas on the 1856 platform. So the last remaining party is split. Well, the secessionists who walked out of the convention in Charleston reconvene after the Northern Democrats reconvened in Baltimore and nominate Vice President John C. Breckinridge of Kentucky. The Republican National Convention was held in Chicago and nominated Abraham Lincoln, edging out such figures as John C. Fremont, who had run in 1856, William H. Seward, who was an abolitionist, edgy but very controversial. And so it's Lincoln to the north. The Republican platform denounces Brown's raid, reaffirms the free soil doctrine, and calls for a transcontinental railroad, as well as homestead legislation to give out land in the plain states to settlers. Something had been blocked for many years by Southerners. You have another group entering the fray, a group dedicated to the Union, including Democrats and former Whigs, forming the Constitutional Union Party. They nominate John Bell of Tennessee, a former senator. They briefly considered Texas Governor Sam Houston, but the old Whigs came to dominate the party and refused to back the Democrat Houston. So basically, the goal of the Constitutional Union Party is simply support the laws, the Union, and the Constitution of the United States. Basically, support the opposite of the fire eaters. They want to support the Union at all costs. But what it basically comes down to is you have two elections here. Look here on page 471. Lincoln against Douglas in the north and Breckinridge against Bell in the south. Lincoln is not on the ballot anywhere in the South. The Republican Party does not exist in the South because at this point it is against expanding slavery into the territories. Oh, the upper north, is more abolitionist, while the Deep South is much more secessionist. The only place where you have any kind of sense of moderation is in these border states. You see the purple ones here. Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina, because they realize war between North and South comes, their states are the battlegrounds. They don't want to see armies fighting in their backyards. Border states are the only place where you have any sense of moderation. But both sides gain a false impression of each other. Lincoln, not on the ballot in the South, never goes to the South, try to pacify Southerners, try to allay their fears. Southerners felt that all Republicans were radicals, full of John Browns, ready to destroy the country. Douglas tried to bring the sections together, but Douglas at this point is 47, weakened by years of disappointment, drinking, and ill health. By October, he realized from early election returns that he was not going to win. They didn't have uniform election dates in 1860, so different states voting at different times. Douglas realizing from key returns in key states he wasn't going to win, so Douglas went to the South to try to allay Southern fears and try to keep them in the Union. Now in the South, you have the election Breckinridge against Bell. The North, the election of Lincoln against Douglas. The election in the North, you have Lincoln winning. In the South, Breckinridge defeats Bell. Now Douglas is on the ballot in a couple of Southern states as well, but it happens that a lot of the Southern Democratic machines basically do what they can to try to kick Douglas off the ballot. Lincoln gets most of the votes, gets 39% of the vote, 1.86 million. 39.8%. That's not even winning all the votes in the North, and he's not even on the ballot in the South. But he had the electoral majority, with 180 electoral votes. But Douglas gets the next 29.5%. But he only gets 12 electoral votes. Douglas is the only candidate to win in both free and slave states. He wins slave Missouri and splits free New Jersey with Lincoln. In the South, Breckinridge gets 18.1% of the vote, 72 electoral votes, less than 1 million votes. Douglas wins the 3 border states, Tennessee, Kentucky, and Virginia, getting 12.6% of the vote, but 39 electoral votes. The election goes to Lincoln. And with this, the South has its greatest fears realized. That not only does the North dominate by the numbers in the House of Representatives, but also put under free states. The North controls Congress, and at the electoral votes, electoral college, the North doesn't even need the South to win the presidential election. So the South is basically politically neutralized, completely locked out. So, on December 20th, 1860, South Carolina, December 6th, 1860, soon after the election, South Carolina called for a convention of delegates for a secession convention to be held on December 20th. At this convention held in Charleston, the convention voted unanimously to secede from the Union. They issued a statement called the Declaration of Cause of Secession, reviewing the threats to slavery and the election of Lincoln, calling the Republican Party a sectional party hostile to slavery, and pulled out of the Union. 6 more states would follow by February 1861, all in the Deep South. Give you a couple handouts here to see how it all breaks down. have two handouts here, secession in the Deep South and secession in the border states. That's exactly what happens and why. Now, secession basically takes place in two different phases. First phase is going from December 1860 to February 1861. Basically, the period immediately after the election. And they go pretty quickly at that point. South Carolina secedes September 20th, 1860. Followed by Mississippi on January 9th, Florida on January 10th, Alabama on January 11th, Georgia shortly afterward, January 19th, and Louisiana on January 26th. Basically, the whole Deep South pulls out. February 7th, 1861, the Confederate States of America is formed, with the initial capital at Montgomery, Alabama. The Alabama state capital. So the Constitutional Convention names Jefferson Davis president, with Alexander Hamilton Stevens of Georgia as vice president. Davis had been a senator from Mississippi. Stevens had been a very prominent politician in Georgia for many years. But it isn't just simply a matter of party lines and party labels. Davis had been a Democrat. Stevens had been a Whig. And in the North, it is Democrats supporting the Union as well as Republicans. Well, then you get to Texas. The case gets a little more complicated. Here you have many people supporting secession, but you have a Unionist governor, Sam Houston. Houston been a protege of Andrew Jackson, devout supporter of the Union. Well, secessionists moved quickly and overwhelmed the Unionists, led by Houston. Secessionists pressured Houston to call a secession convention into session. Houston refuses. So on January 28, 1861, the secession convention voted to secede by a vote of 152 to 6. On February 9th, Houston called for a popular vote to be held 2 weeks later on February 23rd. That is, Houston wants all the people to vote, not simply this convention. Houston and Unionists go all over the state trying to campaign to keep Texas in the Union, facing a lot of strong-arm tactics at the polls. And Texans vote overwhelmingly to support secession. Voted 46,000 in favor of secession to 14,000 against secession. Unionists, interestingly enough, one of the counties along the Red River and the Hill Country. Texas Hill Country, Central Texas area, is an area dominated by German immigrants. People who were against slavery, had no slaves. In fact, even this day, a lot of those communities in Central Texas, so heavily dominated by Germans, you'll see a lot of street signs in German. A lot of newspapers in German. But Houston, even though was still governor, even though the state had now voted against secession, voted against staying in the Union, voted for secession. But Houston refused to support the Confederacy, refused to support Texas' entry into the Confederacy, and the Secession Convention, which was still meeting, voted to oust Houston and any other supporter of the Union from office. So Houston's kicked out of office. Lieutenant Governor Ed Clark is placed in office as governor. Lincoln, even though he still isn't president yet, sent a telegram to Houston offering troops to support Houston to stay in office. Houston considered this. Decided he could not wage a war against Texas and simply stepped aside. Now the inauguration day is March 4th, 1861. James Buchanan is still president. So what does he do during all this? Absolutely nothing. Steps aside, lets the Union fall apart. 7 states secede. Buchanan does nothing. Country is falling apart. And he sits there. While desperate attempts are made to try to conciliate the two sides, Unionists are lamenting for one moment of Jackson, the nullification crisis, threatened to send the army down to South Carolina to keep them from seceding, and it worked. But so much of the South is beyond reconciliation at this point. A little effort is made to hold federal authority. Union garrisons in the South are met by Southern militias and simply abandoned. The Fort Moultrie garrison, just off the coast of South Carolina, moved to Fort Sumter for protection by its commander, Major Robert Anderson, who was a Kentucky Unionist. South Carolina felt this action was provocative, because Fort Sumter is right in the middle of Charleston Harbor. And so you got this huge Union Army presence as a gateway of the South's most important port, among the most important ports outside of New Orleans. Buchanan, though, resisted the South Carolina ultimatum to withdraw from this port. Union ship approached the garrison on January 9, 1861, attempting to resupply the fort. South Carolina troops opened fire on it, and the ship turned back at that instant. But Buchanan ignored the challenge. But there are attempts to try to hold the Union in place. Among those efforts, one was called the Crittenden Compromise. Senator John J. Crittenden of Kentucky offered a series of constitutional amendments to try to conciliate the South. Among those, recognizing slavery in the territory south of line 36 degrees 30 minutes, basically putting a constitutional amendment in effect to extend the Missouri Compromise line. And another to guarantee slavery where it existed. Basically, that would have been the 13th Amendment. And, but the Senate couldn't agree to this. You have other efforts. This is in December 1860. Effort fails. You have the House Committee of 33. By Congressman Thomas Corwin of Ohio. Corwin was initially willing to adopt 2 concessions to the South, going with the Crittenden's amendment to guarantee slavery where it existed, and admission of New Mexico as a slave state. Basically, bringing New Mexico to the Union, saying it's going to be a slave state no matter what. Coleman's amendment to guarantee slavery existed gained tepid support from Lincoln and some Republicans. It barely passed the House and the Senate on March 4th, 1861, but the states refused to ratify it. February 1861, you have the Peace Convention of Virginia. Virginia is still in the Union, barely. This is initiated by a call from the Virginia legislature. Former President John Tyler of Virginia presides over the convention. 21 states send delegates. The 7 seceding states refuse to send delegates, and the convention fails. Basically, the very reason why the convention is being held, those states don't even show up. Tyler, interestingly enough, will be serve in the Confederate Senate during the Civil War. So everything's just kind of on hold and waiting. 7 states seceded. The North's anxious for Lincoln to come in, so some kind of action, any kind of action, can be taken. The nation's on the brink of civil war. Well, Lincoln is inaugurated on March 4th, 1861. 7 states seceded. Lincoln appeals for peace and harmony in his address. Tries to assure the South there was no need for apprehension from his election. He denied the states the right to secede from the Union, deciding that the purpose of the Constitution was built to build a more perfect Union. Calls secession, his words, quote, the essence of anarchy. Said during a speech, quote, in your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not mine, is a momentous issue of civil war. The government will not assail you. You can have no conflict without yourselves being the aggressors. Close by saying we are not enemies, but friends. Well, the South ignored it. They wanted the North out, the Union forces away from Fort Sumter. Major Anderson at Fort Sumter reported to Lincoln that supplies were running low. The Confederates were encircling his base. Interestingly enough, during this run-up to the final confrontation, Confederate forces actually allowed Union troops into Charleston to buy food and vegetables at the local shops. But on April 4th, 1861, Lincoln decided to resupply Fort Sumter. He's informed the South Carolina government by telegraph that he's going to send provisions only, but the Confederate government decided they're going to stop him. Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard, commander of Confederate forces, ordered Union defenders to surrender. Anderson refused, and on April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter. South fires the first shots. Battle lasts for 2 days. On April 14th, Anderson surrenders, his ammunition exhausted. 3,000 shells had hit Fort Sumter, but no one had died inside. See, Fort Sumter was designed from a kind of a sandstone, where basically was hit by more and more artillery shells. Instead of exploding, basically just disintegrated into sandbags, basically. The battle went on for 2 days. In fact, during those 2 days, some of the Union troops inside the fort had a chance for a quick game of baseball. But no one inside the fort died. However, as they are evacuating the fort, 2 men died when a cannon being fired as a ceremonial salute, exploded, killing the two men. I kid you not.
Well, back then, not everything was made to last.
Yeah. You have a lot of weird things happening during the Civil War. There's this one time during the Civil War, baseball is quickly becoming the national pastime. There was this one instance where this one group of Union troops is playing a game of baseball in this open field, and the Union batter hits this line drive out into this little brush of trees where a Confederate sniper is hiding. Union outfielder tries to retrieve the ball where the Confederate sniper shoots and kills the guy and keeps the ball.
Oh, I thought you were going to say the ball hit the guy in the head.
Yeah.
That would have been hilarious.
Yeah. There was a case where in South Carolina, a husband and wife tried to sign up for the Confederate Army together. The wife disguised as man because they're not letting women fight in the Army. Claimed they were just cousins. They might well have been, but they find out that the wife is a man. They kick her out of the Army and they keep him.
Didn't they used to have a lot with women killing?
Yeah, there were quite a few women trying to disguise themselves as men during the Civil War. Some of them because they really believed in the fight. Some of them, well, they were trying to make money the really old-fashioned way.
Wow.
So after Fort Sumter falls, Lincoln calls for troops to put down the rebellion, asking for each state to deliver a number of volunteers to supplement Union numbers so they can put down the war in South Carolina and restore the Union, enforce federal law throughout the South. But at this point, the four remaining southern states pull out of the Union. This is the second part of secession, after Lincoln's call for troops after Fort Sumter. Virginia and Arkansas seceded. Virginia and Arkansas are the only two states to first initially reject secession, then turn around and vote to secede. Secession Convention at Richmond rejected secession on April 4th, 1861 by 2-1 vote. But after Fort Sumter, they turn around and reverse themselves, voting to secede by 88-55. What happens with Virginia is the 50 western counties stay loyal and form their own separate state government in July 1861, which became separate state of West Virginia by 1863. So Virginia had long had these tensions within their state between the title planters in the east and the farmers in the mountains in the west. The mountains, they didn't have any slaves. They were much poorer there. And they were tired of being led around by the eastern title and planters, so say, no, they're not going out of the Union, they're staying in the Union, and there's nothing they can do about it. So West Virginia pulls out. Virginia. Arkansas, secession convention initially rejected secession on February 18, 1861 by a 39-35 vote. And again, in Arkansas, it was the northern and northwestern counties that are voting against secession. With mountains and hills in that area, they're not producing cotton. Little, if any, slavery, so they have a more unionist mindset in that area. That's what's happening in these states in the upper South. They're more mountainous. Their geography is entirely different from the rest of the South. You have the Gulf Coastal Plain in the deep South, where basically everyone can, where it is possible for everywhere for cotton to be grown and other labor-dependent crops like that. But in the upper South, start getting into the mountains, the Ozarks in Arkansas, and the Appalachians in the southeast.
Can't grow anything.
Exactly. Can't grow anything. Can't grow anything. So therefore, what reason do you have to secede? None. That's what it's coming down to, is slavery. One side has slaves, the other one doesn't. Of course, the obvious question here is, Well, what about the men in the South who did not own slaves who were fighting for the Confederacy? Well, there's several different reasons for that. One, you have a draft in the South. All these men had no choice. Secondly, even though they may not have had slaves themselves, slavery was a status symbol. A lot of people believing that one day they could own slaves themselves. A lot of them believed in the racial makeup of the South. It is the system of white supremacy. Others fighting because they really were terrified that the Northern armies coming down and destroying their homes in the South. But it came down to the fact one side had slaves, the other one didn't. Arkansas had basically been waiting on what Missouri was going to do. Arkansas didn't want to be trapped between Louisiana and Missouri. Missouri has ended up kind of being a complicated case, but basically ends up staying in the Union. The last two states, Tennessee secedes on May 7th. North Carolina, surrounded by Virginia, Tennessee, and South Carolina, secedes on May 20th. Now, what about the border states? You got 4 slave states that don't secede. What's happening there? Let's look at Missouri. Here you have a Unionist legislature and a secessionist governor. February 1861, the state legislature authorized the convention to consider secession, but Unionists far outnumbered the secessionists. The governor, Claiborne Jackson, secessionist, declared Missouri neutral and refused to heed Lincoln's call for troops. You had pitched battles erupting between Jackson and Union General Nathaniel Lyon in the summer of 1861. Basically, Governor Jackson's and his supporters are trying to pull Missouri out of the Union by force. Union General Lyon is trying to hold Missouri in the Union by force. The two are fighting all over the state back and forth. Now, Missouri, the geography is very complicated. Start getting north of the Missouri River, the climate's too cool to grow cotton or any of those other slavery-dependent crops. But most of the slavery is taking place in the Mississippi and Missouri River valleys, basically in central Missouri. Get too far into southern Missouri, you've got the mountains. You might have a couple planters here and there, a couple secessionists, but it's like northwestern Arkansas. The hills basically make it impossible for slavery, which was practiced in 1860, to exist. Well, in Missouri, the legislature gets tired of Jackson and set up a provisional government free from Jackson's influence in July. Hamilton Gamble was then named interim governor, who was a Unionist. By October 1861, a convention of Jackson's supporters voted for Missouri to secede, and the Confederate recognized Missouri as having seceded, even though most of the people said Missouri is not pulling out. Missouri, however, stayed in the Union. Confederate influence in the states waned. Get to Kentucky. Here you've got a Unionist governor. Slight majority of the legislature is Unionist. Again, look at Kentucky, much more mountainous even than Tennessee. Central and eastern Kentucky is Appalachia. Well, Governor Bryan McGoffin, that's that for a southern name, declared Kentucky to be neutral, the legislature approving the resolution. In November 1861, Confederate supporters, including some legislators, met and declared Kentucky to be a Confederate state. Confederacy recognized Kentucky's secession, but most of the state government and the United States government refused to recognize it. You know, Kentucky is going to be the only state with representation in both the Union and Confederate cabinets. James Speed is the U.S. Attorney General from Kentucky. John C. Breckinridge was Confederate Secretary of War, again from Kentucky. Delaware, there's no concerted movement for secession in Delaware. Those few fire eaters that were there had left the state and were gone. Lincoln tries to convince Delaware a couple times to free its slaves, but Delaware never went for it. Delaware is actually one of the last states to secede from the Union. Maryland What you have here is the Union armies holding Maryland by force. April 19, 1861, a Baltimore mob attacked Massachusetts troops attempting to reach Washington, D.C. in order to support the Union government. It's actually the first bloodshed of the Civil War. What Lincoln does is he suspends habeas corpus. Basically, he allows officials to arrest people and hold them without charge. And the Constitution, the President does have that power in terms of domestic insurrection. But it had never been done before or since. Union troops occupied Baltimore throughout the war. In 1861, Union troops arrested pro-Confederate politicians and during the election of a Unionist government. And the state constitutional convention abolished slavery in Maryland in 1864. Remember, what they are doing here is slavery. What I'm handing out here is from the Mississippi Declaration of Secession. What you have to understand about the Civil War is no matter what kind of cause you try to throw out against it, how Confederate claim was the cause of it, slavery is at the core of it. The tariff, well, why is the tariff an issue in the South? Because slavery. That's economy structured toward slavery. States' rights. The only state right the South was interested in was, are they going to have slavery or not? And how do we know this? You go to the source. What's Mississippi saying here? Second paragraph of their statement, in as brutally racist terms possible. Our position has thoroughly identified the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Slavery supplies a product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portion of commerce in the earth. These products are peculiar to the climate verging on the tropical regions. By imperious law of nature, none but the black race can bear exposure to the tropical sun. These products have become necessities of the world, and the blow at slavery is the blow at commerce and civilization. That blow has long been aimed at the institutional as the point of reaching its consummation. There was no choice left us but submission to the mandates of abolition or dissolution of the Union, whose principles have been subverted to work out our ruin. Basically, it goes on their next 2 pages talking about how the North had attacked slavery. Essentially, race-based slavery was what Mississippi was depending on, or convinced themselves they depended on, and could consider no alternative. They were fighting to preserve slavery. Now, the Union cannot allow the South to pull out. To secede is the essence of anarchy. As Daniel Webster said years before that, he'd already died by this point, one country, one constitution, one destiny. In fact, the Confederate Constitution, if you read it, it's about 95% of it comes from the American Constitution. But for the Union, this is about preserving the law, preserving the Constitution. Lincoln is not going to make this a war of abolition at this point, because he's afraid that white troops in the North are not going to risk their lives for black slaves. But he knows they will fight to defend the Constitution. They will fight to defend the Union. And that's what he's counting for at the beginning. Now, the Confederate Union armies is General Winfield Scott. Like I said, veteran going all the way back to the War of 1812. A hero of the Mexican War. But he's aging. Doesn't feel like he has the strength left to fight the war. He's also from Virginia. What he's going to do, though, is he's going to design a strategy for the North to defeat the South, called the Anaconda Strategy. Basically, to take up to seize control of the major waterways of the South, divide the South, entwine and crush it like an anaconda snake. Basically, cut off their commerce, means of moving troops, divide and conquer. Taking the Mississippi, taking up Tennessee, the Cumberland rivers, and the upper South, taking up the Mississippi River, moving in from there. He retires shortly after the war begins. Lincoln offers command of the Union Army to Colonel Robert E. Lee. He's a good officer, sound tactical mind. Lee nearly accepts. But Lee considers he's going to have to raise up arms against his own people in Virginia, and sides against it, resigning his commission as a U.S. Army officer. Interestingly enough, a lot of the war was going to be fought over land owned by Robert E. Lee. And Union troops seized his property during the war, turned it into a gravesite. Arlington National Cemetery was on the side of Robert E. Lee's property. Well, this war has had a lot of different names. What else has been the Brothers' War. The war deeply divided a lot of families. You have John J. Crittenden, author of the Crittenden Compromise. He had sons in both armies. Franklin Buchanan, no relation to the former president, was in command of the Confederate ship Virginia, sank the Union ship USS Congress, knowing his brother was on board. Lincoln's Attorney General had a son in the Confederate Army. Mary Todd Lincoln, the First Lady, she was from Kentucky, she had a brother, 3 half-brothers, and 3 brothers-in-law, all in the Confederate Army. It led to a lot of Lincoln's critics questioning Mary Todd Lincoln's loyalty. Every state except South Carolina in the South had troops fighting for the Union. About 100,000 men altogether. Northern Arkansas, you had the peace societies. You also had some of these in Texas as well. Basically, men still devoted to supporting the Union. Well, several of these societies caught out in early 1861-62 and given a choice either to fight for the Confederacy or hang for treason. Gainesville, Texas, about a dozen men were hanged for treason. Largest mass execution in U.S. history. In Arkansas, some of these men fought with the Confederacy. Others escaped Missouri, fought and joined up the Union units. Despite Union strengths, the South had many excellent officers, and the Confederacy had prospects of foreign assistance in 1861. That is, so America's top competitors, particularly England and France, they wouldn't mind seeing America cut off at the knees. Even though slavery was illegal in England and France and England are looking to immobilize their greatest competitor while they're considering supporting the Confederacy. Now looking at resumes, Jefferson Davis, on paper, looks like the better leader. He had been a veteran of the Mexican War, former Secretary of War in the President Polk's cabinet, U.S. Senator. Lincoln had been a one-term congressman, lawyer, no education. So on paper, it looks like Davis is a better leader, but actually sometimes it doesn't quite matter what's your credentials are. It does matter what you're willing to do with what you have. Lincoln had a lot more to work with. Lincoln was clever. Lincoln could take advice. Davis basically watched it all fall apart. Now, the Confederacy believed it could fight a defensive war on their home turf. The Union Navy, beginning the war, consisted of 90 ships. It had 16,000 men in the Army, mostly defending the western frontier against the Native Americans. So the North has to build up its forces fast, expand their navy. What's going to happen is the North is going to end up blockading the whole South. But they're going to have to pull a bunch of men from the frontier to fight the war, which means a lot of tribes will be allying the Confederacy because of this, and a lot of tribes will be basically looking at the opportunity to even the score against what the U.S. government had done to them. Well, nevertheless, North and South looking for a quick victory initially. Let's get to the first battle of Bull Run. It's called the First Battle of Manassas. The two different sides will call name battles after different things. In the North, they name it after the nearest landmark or nearest settlement. South will name it after the nearest body of water.
This was the first land engagement, is that right?
That is correct. July 21st, 1861. General Beauregard for the South, General Earl McDowell for the North. McDowell believed his 37,000 troops would easily sweep away the outnumbered Confederates. They'd march on to Richmond. After Virginia secedes, the Confederate capital is moved to Richmond. So, Northern troops are marching into Virginia, chanting, "On to Richmond, on to Richmond." You have civilians and dignitaries marching out with both armies, trying to watch the festivities. Basically, just going out and watch the battle.
Ready for the bloodbath.
Oh, yeah. Confederate time of the battle, though, stemmed back and forth. The Confederate reinforcements arrived and stemmed the tide. McDowell decided to withdraw late in the afternoon as young, inexperienced troops fled to panic. But the exhausted Confederate troops refused to give chase. So the youth Confederate troops hold their ground, but there are 4,500 casualties in this battle, killed, wounded, or captured on both sides. The Union realized they must prepare for a long conflict at this point. Interestingly enough, one major figure of this battle, Thomas Jefferson Jackson, gets his nickname from this battle. It's Stonewall Jackson. Basically, at the height of the battle, one Confederate commander is trying to rally his troops, trying to get them to hold the lines, keep them from falling back. He looks over at Jackson's forces and said, "Look at Jackson, he's standing there like a stone wall." It's Stonewall Jackson. Jackson, unfortunately, will die later in the war, killed by his own troops. Friendly fire, basically. A lot of smoke and fog, and
Can't see it.
And mistake them for the enemy.
Yeah. Well, the Civil War is the first modern war in many ways. 1 in 12 adult males fought. Nearly 700,000 people died in the war, including both the military and civilian casualties. This is more than any other American war. So in civil wars, usually have much higher casualties. Because fighting is usually very close. Everyone's right up on top of each other. In cases the fighting becomes very personal. So you have those, a modern war fought with new weapons, new techniques. You have ironclad ships being used in battle for the first time ever. Observation balloons. The North is using hot air balloons to observe Confederate troop movements. Better rifles. The Gatling gun is introduced. Gatling gun is basically a primitive machine gun. Actually, have this turret of rifles, and they turn this crank, which causes this turret to spin around and fire.
Though they weren't very accurate at the beginning.
Yeah, not very accurate. They're going to get better as time goes on,
But they do tear things to shreds.
Yeah. A lot of Union officers weren't convinced about how well they could be used, and got a few generals using them.
If anything, I think it was more like just a big shotgun.
Yeah.
Spread out everywhere.
Actually, you have trench warfare being used for the first time. Basically, troops digging in and fighting. You have European military officials coming to observe the fighting, learn from new American military tactics.
Did they have to worry about having trench feet back then?
Like I said, there were a lot of problems. things like trench foot, Confederate Army, they're having problems with even finding enough shoes for the troops. That's when we get to Gettysburg and Antietam. That disease was the leading cause of death during the Civil War.
Including malaria.
Disease, infection, they had no antibiotics.
Yeah.
Surgical techniques were amputation at best.
Now, where most of the diseases...
Yeah, exactly. Basic bathroom techniques. Problem is you have all these troops in close quarters. One person gets sick, everybody gets sick. And somebody does their bathing, their business, the same water they're drinking out of. Contamination, typhus, measles, things like that. Smallpox. Exactly. Actually, you've had entire units in the Confederacy were dissolved and reorganized because so many men died of a disease just waiting to be called in the fights. But next time, though, we'll talk more about the draft and the dead horse claims, the war, a little bit more on the war. See what happens after this point. After the First World War, it's kind of a standstill. We'll see how it goes on from here.